Thank you, Father Ellis. All right. Well, it is a privilege to be here. I haven't been here in 20 years. Father Ellis organized a conference, well, 20 years ago, I think it was, about Lebanon, and that was quite a memorable conference because we had a group of Syrian and Lebanese scholars almost come to blows over whether tabbouleh is better in Syria or Lebanon. We take our food quite seriously, obviously. Anyway, it's a privilege to be here, and I want to keep this rather informal because I see, just looking at you, that most of you probably know more about this topic than I do, so I think it'll be much more conversational. We have, I think, about an hour and a half, but what I would like to do is set it up for about 45 minutes in which I go through the presentation, and at any time, if it's not making sense or you have a comment, again, I really don't think we have to be very formal with this. Please feel free to just, kind of raise your hand, ask a question, what have you. So we'll do it that way. Does that make sense? Now, the premise of this whole talk is that Arabs have been elided. They have been marginalized, ignored in American history and society. As I look across at you, I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know. But in fact, I don't know how many of you have put kids through high school, but Arab Americans are never mentioned. We just don't appear. But the only time we appear in American public discourse, of course, you can imagine, is when it comes to violence and conflict, and especially after 9/11. And this is not anything new. So I don't want you to think that 9/11 somehow created this notion of who Arabs are. In fact, ideas about the Middle East, about Muslims, and about Arabs and an ethnic community have been fairly negative all the way back to the 17th century at the time of Thomas Jefferson. The idea of piracy in North Africa became very popular. You have lots of travel accounts describing sort of the barbaric notions of Arabs in North Africa. You fast forward to the 1950s, again in sort of pulp fiction, you find this representation of Arabs as lecherous, violent, not trustworthy. And of course, Arabs are always angry. And you always have to put a kafia on them just to make sure that everybody knows that that's what makes you an Arab, because otherwise you could be Italian, you could be, Latin American, heck, you could be anything at that particular moment. But generally speaking, they're just always angry. Now, if you want to get a glimpse of this kind of image, through Hollywood anyway, just go to YouTube, the source of information for all of our students these days, and type in Planet of the Arabs. You can already understand that it's a play on the movie Planet of the Apes. And what it is, it's a collage of films produced from the silent era, with Valentino and the Sheikh, as they used to call him, the Sheikh, all the way to probably yesterday. And every step of the way, the images about Arabs is generally negative. In fact, not generally, but definitely negative. Now, one, of course, must hasten to add that every ethnic community in the United States has had its share of negative. So you can think of Italians and mafiosos, Colombians and drugs, African Americans and violence. So the correlation of an ethnic community to a stereotype is not unique to Arabs. However, what's interesting is that that idea about Arabs has lasted over, as I said, 200 some years. It's a long-lasting one. And while other communities, of course, with the exception perhaps of African Americans, have been integrated into mainstream America, so the Irish were, in the 19th century, were considered to be sort of at the bottom. Now, of course, St. Patrick's Day and the positive images of the Irish is much more celebrated. With Arab Americans, that has not been the case. We continue to be sort of in a negative holding pattern, if you will. And it is unfortunate. I remember a film, and what's interesting about this is the power of the representation in all of this. I remember a film that came out in the late 1980s, I think early 1990s, and it's called Delta Force. Has anybody ever seen that movie? And Delta Force is that amazing, brilliant actor Chuck Norris. I mean, real depth to this man. And it's based on a real event. There was an airline called Trans World Airlines, and now it's not long gone. A plane was hijacked. It landed in the airport in Beirut, and the current speaker of the Lebanese parliament, Nabih Berri, negotiated the release. Unfortunately, 3 people were killed. Now, in Delta Force, that is not how it plays out. And Delta Force was made by 2 Israeli cousins who made a series of these B films about the Middle East. And there's this one scene, I remember it, because I saw this in Lebanon. So my friend said, let's go see Delta Force. I'm like, oh, I don't want to go see Delta Force. No, let's go see Delta Force. So we went to see Delta Force, right? So here you imagine the Lebanese are sitting, watching themselves represented on the screen, and Chuck Norris is killing us, in essence, right? What's remarkable, there's this one scene, and the plane is landing in Beirut, or supposedly Beirut, and the windows are open, which is kind of bizarre. I've never heard of a plane with the windows open, but of course for the camera. And there's a pilot and a co-pilot and a civilian, another bizarre, and we don't see that anymore. And it's kind of taxiing into to a stop, and it cuts to this image of these people, many of them wearing keffiyeh, holding World War I and World War II issue weapons. Really outdated, and literally this is what they're saying, rah, 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 like barking dogs. So they take the language of 1,600 years of civilization, of culture, of science, of philosophy, of poetry, of religion, they take all of that and reduce it to dogs barking. And then the pilot, co-pilot says, who are these people? And the camera cuts back to them to reinforce the kind of the dog-like behavior. Then it cuts back to the civilian, who very helpfully intones, they're Arabs, right? And the pilot asks the obvious question, how do you know? Well, for the viewer, you cut back to them barking, and then back to the civilian who says, I know, right? That moment. And the bizarre thing about this representation is that here we are, all Lebanese, cheering. I wasn't, I would like to say. But here are people who were actually cheering when he was shooting and killing the Lebanese. I mean, this is the power of representation. So my point here is very simple. Arabs do not appear in this kind of American imaginary, if you will, in American textbooks, in American discourse, in American imagination, unless they tend to be fairly violent, associated with terrorism, violence, conflict, and so on and so forth. The argument I would like to present today, and I think many of you have lived through this, so I'm just emphasizing your life really, more than anything else, is that that's nonsense. That Arabs have been part of this country for over 150 years. They weren't called Arabs when they first arrived, they were called Syrians. But in fact, they came from the Middle East. So Arabic-speaking peoples, to put it in those terms, Arabic-speaking peoples have been in this country since the 1880s. And they've been part of American society, and they have done everything that every other ethnic community has done. For better or for worse. I do not want to romanticize that everybody came here and was successful and they're all great people. In fact, I was just looking at the mugshot of a guy who was in Alabama and who was a crook. He was accused of grand larceny. His name is Yusuf Saliba, right? And you can see his fingerprints. So it's not like everybody was perfect, but they were complex, and in their complexity, they were part of American life. And that's what I would like to present today. Now, as most of you know, there are two waves of immigration about Arabic-speaking peoples. The first one is from 1880 to about 1930, actually. 1940 is a little pushing it. And the second one is from the 1965, and does everybody know why 1965 is a critical date? No, it's actually 1965 is the Johnson Act. That is when the browning of America, as it comes to be known, that is when, in fact, they stopped the quota system. Between 1923, with the Immigration Act of 1923, and 1965, there was a strict quota system that tried to attract a lot more people from Northern Europe than it allowed for people from the Middle East and various other places. In 1965, that quota system was eradicated. And that's when, in essence, you begin to see literally the browning of America, where you get a lot more people from the third world arriving than you had ever before. And in many ways, the conversation we're having today about immigration and about wanting to have more people from Norway and less people from Haiti is, in many ways, a reaction to the 1965 Act, that sense of anxiety. But the first element of the wave is from 1880 to 1940, the second wave from 1965 to today. And generally speaking, as you can sort of tell from these characterization, they were slightly different in terms of how you would imagine them. We can talk about it at length. What I'd like to focus on today, actually, is primarily the first one. Okay? We can, in the discussion, talk about what happens with the second wave, which I was part of, and Nadia, I think you were part of that. How many people came here after 1965? All right, so good number of you guys. I'm not going to ask how many of you came here in 1880, because obviously that won't work. So let's begin with why people leave. Right? This is a shot of the port of Beirut, and you can see the steamship in the distance. And folks, as I said, for the most part, if you map them, where they came primarily from what we know today as Lebanon. Although obviously there's stuff from Palestine, There's stuff from Syria and Aleppo, various parts of Syria. But the great majority came from Lebanon, and the great majority of that came from an area called Mount Lebanon, the central district of Lebanon as we know it today. And can anybody tell me what the biggest circle is on that map? What town is that? Who said Zahle? Wallahi, if I had, I would give you a present, Zahle. So there was a poet, his name is Sa'id Aql. And he was very famous for saying, we are going to make the world Lebanon, and we're going to make Lebanon Zahle. He was from Zahle himself. The Zahlewis, or the people from Zahle, are very proud. But they literally, this is based on a 1908 business directory. More or less, I would think is fairly accurate representation of where most of these people came from. Now the question is why? Why would they leave? There are many different theories, and in fact, when we do oral histories, and that's one of the things we do at the center, is we are a center dedicated to preserving the memories of past and contemporary immigrants from Lebanon in particular. When we do oral histories, the story is always pretty much the same. It's either that there were persecution of Christians or the Turks. They were escaping the Turks. The reality is, as many of you know, memory is not reliable. That's not why they left. They were part of the great 19th century migration. To date, the 19th century still represents the largest human population movement in history, percentage-wise. In other words, in the 19th century, the percentage of people who moved from their place to another place is still the largest percentage that we have. The majority of them left quite simply because of economics. And that's why most immigrants leave. Yes, there are refugees of war. We see that with Syria. In the 19th century, probably the biggest population was a Jewish population from Eastern Europe who had suffered in the pogroms of Russia, and they had to escape. So today, if you encounter anybody who is Jewish of Eastern European background, their ancestors very likely came in the 1880s, 1890s because of persecution. But in general, the great majority of human population movement is what we call either voluntary or out of economic needs, depending how you want to see it. In Lebanon, or the area we're looking at, this was very much because of the collapse of the silk market. Right? So the area both up and down the Eastern Mediterranean, so forget the terms of national terms, Lebanon, Syria, but up and down the Eastern Mediterranean, silk was a huge product because the Europeans came knocking in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and all of a sudden there was silk mania. People were literally taking any piece of land they had and putting mulberry trees. I'm sure you all know what mulberry trees are, you've seen them. And the problem with that, of course, is that when you have about 80% of your land going to silk, raising silkworms, you become in many ways tied to the global market of silk. Does that make sense? So if the market fluctuates, you're in trouble because silk cocoons are really hard to eat and they're not very nutritious. Mulberries are great, but after a while you get diarrhea. So it's in essence, you don't have wheat, you don't have lentils, you don't have the staples of life. So when they shifted, and it's a very irrational economic decision, the peasantry of Lebanon as well as the merchants reoriented the Lebanese economy in major ways, or the economy of Mount Lebanon, towards silk. When the silk prices began to collapse, you can see the correlation. The number of people leaving went up. Does that make sense so far? Now, at the same time that this is happening, we also are seeing the population go up. Because after 1860, between 1860 and World War I, Lebanon entered, or the area I'm calling Lebanon, entered what's known as a long peace. It was a semi-independent entity within the Ottoman Empire, and in general, we don't see any conflict in this time period at all. Plus, there's an improvement in sanitation and hygiene, and vaccination enters the picture. So all of a sudden, you have a lot of people. So at the same time that prices are going down, the number of mouths to feed is going up. The third dynamic is all of a sudden a new type of transportation. So you begin to see steamships that are, not this one obviously, that are beginning to make the rounds. So what they would do is they would stop in Beirut, then Haifa, then Alexandria, then Marseille. And from Marseille, they either take a boat that goes to South America and North America, or they take the train and they go up to Le Havre or Cherbourg, another two French ports, and they cross the Atlantic. The whole trip took about 6 weeks. And the cost keeps coming down more and more. And as you can tell, this is an advertisement from an early Arabic newspaper in New York called Al Ayyam from 1898. And these are the names. So for those of you who don't read Arabic, St. Louis, St. Paul, New York, Paris, these are the ships that are being offered for the Syrians, cross-Atlantic Is this making sense? So basically we have three factors: economic downturn, demographic uptick, and all of a sudden the port of Beirut is linked to these fast-moving ships. And that facilitates the movement. Now, the argument usually goes is that one of the earliest people to ever see the United States was due to the World Fair. So probably the most famous of which is the Chicago World Fair, when you have the Cairo Street, which was the most popular street. The rest of the Chicago World Fair was losing money, but the Cairo Street was making a lot of money. And it was a replica, authentic, quote unquote, of Cairo, including belly dancing. But the interesting thing is they imported the outfits from Paris because the outfits were scandalous. And the sort of Moulin Rouge, I'm sure you all heard of them, that's basically where they brought the outfits from. And that begins the craze in America of belly dancing, in which it becomes popular for about 20-some years. But they also had something from Persia, something from Morocco. But the point is, a lot of the people who worked the world fairs, and there were many of them, by the way, it becomes a circuit all across the United States. Many of the early ones were what were called Syrians, not in any national sense, but in the sense of Greater Syria. So all these things combined, plus, of course, Presbyterian missionaries who are in Beirut and other places, begins to encourage people to travel. So that's why they left. And this is the first family, not the first individual, but the first family. They're called the Arbili, but actually it's the Arbini. When they Latinized it, it becomes Arbili. And the Arbinis actually are from a small town outside Damascus called Arbin, hence the Arbini. They're Greek Orthodox, and the father, who's right here, was a professor at, a teacher at the Syrian Protestant College. You all know what that is. It's the precursor to the American University in Beirut, a school that was started in the 1860s by American Presbyterian missionaries, and today continues to be one of the most prestigious universities in the Middle East. So he was the first one to bring the family. She's the niece, and the rest are his sons in that regard. And he was a medical doctor. His oldest son was, I think he was a doctor too. And then one of these guys became a dentist. Now the challenge for any immigrant group, including these Arabic speakers, was how do you belong to a new place that at best is indifferent to you, but at worst is quite hostile to you. You have to remember that many of these people are coming in at a time when there was massive influx of immigrants in the United States. The very conversations we are having today, the very tensions, the very anxieties that we are seeing today manifested were playing out with nativism and the rise of the KKK. This is all happening around that time period. I'm sure you have heard many, many arguments against Muslims coming here, and those who are very much threatened by Muslims argue that Muslims are going to bring the Sharia into American life. If you turn back the clock to the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, the KKK's primary attack was Catholics. And they accused Catholics of secretly trying to bring papism into the United States, and that papism does not fit at all with democracy. Does that ring any bell at all? Right? So the same anxieties, it's just about Catholics at that particular moment. And again, because Catholics were coming in large numbers, especially the Italians. And of course the Irish before them. So the question is, how do you fit? Now, by the way, these numbers are modern numbers, so do not, this is not from the 1880s, 1940s. This is the statistics, and any number I put up there is a guesstimate. Anybody who says otherwise is probably lying. The foreign minister of Lebanon, Gibran Bassil, I don't know if you've heard of him. Every time, I was listening to him give a speech at the Lebanese Diaspora Energy Conference, and he began by saying, there are 5 million Lebanese in Brazil. By the time he finished his speech, which was literally 15 minutes, there were 12 million Lebanese in Brazil. The number is 998,000 and some, right? But of course, the inflation of numbers is not the issue here. But I just wanted to show you this map because they literally went everywhere. Australia, really? Who goes to Australia at the end of the 19th century? It's like it's a penal colony and they don't like brown people. But they ended up there. They ended up there, actually. And they ended up in South Africa, and they ended up in South America. They were everywhere. In fact, if you go today to Terra del Fuego, does anyone know where Terra del Fuego is? It's at the bottom, right here. Literally, it is, if you take one step, you're going to land in the sea and swim to the Antarctica. There's a restaurant there built in the 1920s by immigrants from Lebanon. And in fact, the senator representing that district is a descendant of early Lebanese immigrants. I mean, went everywhere.
They didn't go to Asia.
Sorry?
They didn't go to Asia.
They did, actually. They were in the Philippines, and they were in South Asia, although we don't really know the numbers very much. But it's a good point you raise. Where they went is basically where there was money to be made. Our notion of immigrants is they were escaping, and they wanted to go away completely. In fact, that is nonsense. Immigrants wanted to go make money and go home. And I'm not just talking about Arabic speakers. I'm talking about Italians, Germans. Most immigrants aren't leaving because they hate the place so much, although I'm sure there are some, and they probably hate their family to a certain extent of running away. But the majority wanted to go make money, come back, live a very comfortable life. And if you look at the rate of return amongst Arabic speakers, it's about 36%, we estimate. It's very difficult, again, to estimate. Amongst Northern Italians, it's close to 60% went back, right? And for those of you who know Lebanon, I'm sure you've seen the red tile roofs. That's what they wanted to do. They would go back and build a house with red tiles to just prove to everybody they made money. And they would take with them, I was telling Father Ellis, I have this fantastic picture from 1920 in which a guy and his wife, he's dressed in a white seersucker suit, wearing a Panama hat, and his wife has this fantastic plume and hat this big. And they're standing literally in the middle of a mountain of nowhere. There's not a tree, and they have a Ford Model T car being pulled by 2 donkeys up to the village. And you see the peasants standing there. There are 2 peasants looking, and there's this amused look on their face because there's no gas station, there's no mechanic, there's no road. They're bringing it back to show we made money. Right? And it's not only them. Yemeni immigrants who work, by the way, the Yemeni immigrants who go from here all the way to, I think, Indonesia, when they come back, they actually literally bring back a car, take it apart, pack it on camels, take it 500 miles inland, put it back together. Just to show that they have made money, right? In that regard. So they went everywhere. In the United States, they also went everywhere. Arabs, more than any other ethnic community, literally went everywhere. If you look at Italians, they did go in various places, there's no doubt. But their numbers, by the way, were in the millions. We're talking about 120,000, 130,000 maximum, who came to North America, another couple 100,000 that went to Argentina and Brazil. And generally speaking, we tend to think this is where they stayed. And of course, you can tell from the darker shades that indeed, including this area here, and Dr. Ferrer wrote about that, there's a large numbers of people here. But what is remarkable to me is they literally went everywhere. There's this woman who was writing in 1896. She ends up in Montana at mining towns, peddling for prostitutes. And she writes this letter home, telling her husband how nice the prostitutes are because they give her a good tip and they buy lace and silk and all the good stuff. And her husband would write her, but her husband couldn't, he was, I think he had a bum leg or something, so he couldn't immigrate himself. And he would write her these letters saying, when are you coming home? And she'd say, I don't think I'm coming home. She never went home. Oh, sorry, she went home, brought her oldest son, and came back straight to the United States. She was having too much fun in Montana. But Montana, really? Anyway, so they went pretty much everywhere. Yes?
I'm just wondering, why was it that they spread out?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So, the reason they spread out more than like the Poles primarily were Midwestern, the Irish were concentrated in major cities. So, generally speaking, the areas that you see up here in large concentrations were industrial areas. So we're talking about Detroit, we're talking about New York, which was the largest industrial area actually. We're talking about Lawrence, Massachusetts, which had at one point the largest concentration of Arabic speakers in all the United States, textile mills. But the thing that drove them everywhere was peddling. Right? So there were really 2 major types of work they did. They either worked factories. I'll show you later a slide that shows their distribution of occupation. But the 2 biggest jobs is either factory work or peddling. And peddling becomes fairly easy. Let me just go real quick, come back to her. So peddling becomes an easier way of making money for people who don't have much capital, don't have much language. So in essence, I'll go back to this map. So what happens is, they start out here, and then they would branch out. And there's a guy, for example, I think he was in Indiana. He literally would put people on trains and say, you're going to go down to Texas. And they'd give them sacks of stuff to sell, and he would send them down to Texas. Right? So think of it as kind of like this kind of branching of a Sears walking catalog, or in today's language, an Amazon catalog. Right? I mean, these guys literally would carry, very few of them had carriages like that. Most of them actually had what's called caixa, which comes from the Portuguese word caque, which is a box. And they would carry one on each hand and one on their back. And they would go to farmhouses, they would go to remote towns, and they would go into cities, and they would sell. And then when they finished selling, they would come back, pick up more from their supplier, and then go out again. And so as the market crowded, let's say 10 peddlers begin to discover that this town in Indiana you can make a lot of money, then one adventurous soul goes out a little further. You see what I'm saying? And slowly but surely you end up with this kind of spread. Any other questions? Is this making sense? No, but I really have to say that the myth that we have is that it was all peddlers, but in fact it wasn't. Just to give you an idea here, you can see that a good percentage, this is from the 1910 census, a good percentage of them were working in factories, right? I mean, you do have dry goods stores and what have you, but they really worked in everything. And in fact, if you go to North Dakota, many of them were homesteaders in that regard. So we have a variety of of work that they did. And as we will see later, well, I mean, you see now, women work as much as men, and that created a lot of tensions within families, because women working outside the house becomes an issue of gender roles and what have you. Any questions, any other things? Okay. So the belonging, so work was one way in which you belonged to the new society. And the pattern was that you would work in a factory, you would work as a peddler, you'd work something else, gather just enough money that you can open up a store, like this store in the mountains of North Carolina, El Khoury. But if you look at the spread, these are all the various stores throughout this area. Okay, it's spread everywhere. But one thing I also want to note here is, generally speaking, we tend to think, the story told afterwards is that they came, they worked hard, and they succeeded. Actually, a lot of them failed, the truth be told. We have evidence of that. We have bankruptcy papers. We have people who have been taken to court. And we just have stories of people. But, I mean, it's not fun to come and say, I came, worked hard, but I really failed. So they always told the stories that we hear are about success. But in fact, there are many people that just didn't make it. Because think about it for a second. I mean, these guys are coming to a place that is very alien in every way. Not only language and culture and traditions or what have you. I mean, it's alien in the sense that even the air is different. The light is different, right? I mean, I think the light in the Middle East is very different than the light here. Seriously, I mean, if you stand, stand in Haifa or you stand in Burmena and you watch the light, it's a very different kind of light. And the fruits and the vegetables taste different. They surely do, let me tell you. I mean, when I first came here and ate a tomato, I thought, what the heck is this thing? And then they wanted to sell me a cucumber that was this big, this thick, and so what is that? Where are the real cucumbers, right? I mean, so those things, I mean, the sense and flavor of home is hard to abandon. And there was loneliness. Some of these people were working for days and weeks, sometimes without seeing another Arabic speaker. I mean, we cannot ignore the fact that this was hard, back-breaking work. There are these two guys that froze to death in North Dakota during a blizzard because they had no shelter. So it wasn't just all glamorous and everybody succeeded. Some people really didn't. And the other way they belong, and this is something that is completely ignored, is that they actually fought in America's wars from the beginning. In Cuba, in the Philippines, in World War I, World War II, and of course, we know subsequent wars. We don't know the percentage. I collected the conscription records for the community in North Dakota, and their conscription rate was actually higher than the general public. But if you look at other places, they were less. So we don't really know, but they certainly served. And in this picture, by the way, this is a Badur family. It's the father who fought, I think he fought in the Philippines, and who's congratulating his son who's going off to war in World War I. Right, so in every way, they became part of American life. But by being part of American life, they encountered something they had not known about, race. When they arrived in the 1880s, 1890s, especially in the South, but not only in the South, they are entering the Jim Crow America, where people are mapped by their color. And as one person I was interviewing said, there are three things you didn't want to be in the South: a foreigner, a Catholic, and black. He says, I was 2 out of 3. Those are not great batting averages, as he said it, right? So they were alien in many different ways, and race becomes a very powerful element. And by the way, what's interesting is that they encounter the same thing in Australia and South Africa. All three countries are racially segregated regimes. So the question for them becomes very poignant. It's not just simply that you have a senator. I just wanted to quote somebody from Pennsylvania. But Senator Reid was particularly vitriolic because he actually was one of the sponsors for the Immigration Act of 1923. He really did not want people coming from non-Northern European countries.
That sounds like Trump now.
Well, I mean, again, I'm sort of, yeah, there are echoes. I mean, there are echoes. And again, the same arguments. Foreigners are taking our jobs. They're bringing crime and they're bringing disease. Those are the same arguments you hear over and over again. And of course, then and today, the statistics don't bear out that, but it doesn't matter because emotionally, those arguments are very powerful. Now, for them, though, they had to sort of figure out, because race was central to their existence. And it becomes very critical when there's a series of court cases in which they are seeking to become naturalized American citizens. And after the 1923 Act, actually before that, because there was an act in 1886 called the Asiatic Exclusion Act. So anybody from Asia was to be excluded, which was originally directed at Japanese and Chinese. But if you look at geography, they came from Asia, in essence, West Asia. And all of a sudden, they began to lose cases. The most famous of that is a case of a guy by the name of George Dowell. And he was based in South Carolina. And that, the judge in that case said, you cannot be an American citizen because you are not a free white person. George Dowell, and this is the one time in which the whole community mobilized behind this one cause. They were a very fractious community, by the way. They argued with each other a lot. I know you're shocked, but they really did. And they were very nasty and vitriolic. There were two newspapers, Mir'at al-Gharb, Greek Orthodox, and Al-Huda, Maronite. Na'um Kerzil, who was the editor, and Haddad, who was the editor of Mir'at al-Gharb, they hated each other. And you should see the language they used. But anyway, this is the one time when everybody rallied, because they understood if they lose this case, they're going to be out of here. And so here's the argument that they made. We cannot be denied citizenship and naturalization right because we are white, and we are white because we are Christian. Right? I mean, so think about it for a moment. So what they tried to do is to map their religion, which is something they're aware of, is how they identify, onto race. And their argument is that Jesus, if he arrived here today, you would let him in, and we're followers of Christ long before you jerks. Right? You white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We were Catholics, I mean, we were Christians long before, therefore. And the two people who defended them were Jewish. Because they were worried that if these guys were going to be denied citizenship, next is going to be the Jews. And they won the case. But what is really interesting, that same argument was played out in the Supreme Court in South Africa and the Supreme Court in Australia. And in all three cases, they won. So they succeeded in becoming white to a certain extent. Because to become white, now I'm not saying that immediately they were allowed into the country clubs and people loved them. In fact, until the 1970s, if you were in Mississippi or Louisiana or other places, if you didn't descend from pure bred white, they weren't going to let you in. And not to be too sure, but I mean, Raleigh, we have a country club, the Raleigh Club, that didn't allow blacks through the 1990s. Right? So, but to a certain extent, and there's a wonderful book, by the way, if you're kind of really more curious about this, is How the Irish Became White. It's an amazing book because the Irish were considered, in the language of the time, Negroes, right? They were not considered white. But the way they did it, and the way that Arabic speakers did it, is by, first of all, arguing in the courts, but also by saying we are above those Mongolians, by which they meant the Chinese and the Japanese, and we're certainly above blacks. So they had to accept the racial divisions and integrate themselves into at least one of the ranks of the whites in order to be able to safeguard themselves. And you begin to see this debate going on within the community. So there's a guy by the name of Dr. Michael Steed out of Elk City, Oklahoma, one of the first people to ever establish a cooperative hospital for farmers who were dying because they didn't have money to go to see it. And he was attacked by the KKK mercilessly, both for his work with poor farmers as well as because he was Arab in essence. He was arguing that you cannot accept.
Who came up with the term Caucasian?
Well, the term the term Caucasian comes from the 1880s, right? I mean, it becomes. So what you have is these people that are trying. There are a series of these books. They're trying to classify the world into ethnic categories, right? And how sort of you combine it. And as the number of white people expanded, right, you had to go beyond the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You had to include Southern Europeans and to a certain extent Eastern Europeans. And all of a sudden, this term Caucasian emerged from the Caucasus region. But what's interesting is that there's also a debate whether race was an issue of color or an issue of culture. By the time we get to this time period, it becomes culture. And the argument is these people cannot fit within American culture. Not because one of the judges says you can't really judge, because if a guy works out in the fields all day, let's say he's from Scottish-Irish background, he's going to turn dark. So it's not an ocular thing, it's not the eyes, but it's the culture, right? Whether you can be an American or not. And it's an argument, by the way, we're seeing today, right? Whether people can fit in or not. So the point is they had to accept this racial division and integrate themselves into it and align themselves with it. But like Michael Steed, there was a big argument, and he rejected the idea of race. He says we should not ally ourselves with the whites. We should ally ourselves with every other immigrant community because we should not accept this racial division. He didn't win, to say the least.
What did the Muslims do?
So we don't really know the percentage of people who came here who are Christian, Druze, or Muslim because Ellis Island then and today, we don't record religion. The census is not allowed to record religion. So we don't know. And names are unreliable ways of doing it. I mean, unless somebody's called Muhammad and somebody's called Ilyas, then it's fairly obvious. But a lot of times the names are like Yusuf. Yusuf could be used by a Druze, by a Muslim, by a Christian. You don't really know. So we don't really know that. The one community that we know that is Shia, that ended up in North Dakota, homesteading, slowly but surely, like a lot of ethnic communities, they integrate. In fact, many of them, if you go to their some of their graves, it's really interesting because you have sort of their names and then you have a crescent, right? But they've adopted Christian names because they intermarry locally and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent, at that time, Muslims weren't seen in the same way we're seeing them today because they weren't seen as large numbers. The greater concern was ethnicity, not religion, in that regard. So, on one hand, then, you had to belong. You had to fit in. In transit in Marseille, you take off your peasant clothes and you buy or acquire some, Frenzy clothes, some clothes that look allows you to fit in. You learn a few words on the boat here, a few words to get by. If you have a business, you basically try to make sure that it caters to the population at large. In essence, you're maintaining somehow a link. But what's also important to understand, and this is very common with every ethnic community, is publicly you belong, but privately you want to maintain a sense of who you are. They're not ashamed of who they are. They still want the olive oil and the burghul, and they want to, make their food and they want to live their lives. But there becomes, to a certain extent, this bizarre situation in which they become liminal, in between. Publicly, they are trying to be American. Privately, they're trying to maintain a sense of identity. And in essence, they become neither nor, which is not a negative thing, by the way, but it's just the way immigrants are. We fit, we don't fit. When I first came here, I stayed here for a few years. I went to see my sister, and the first thing she says, "Oh my gosh, look at your hair, you're American." Because I had let my hair grow into an afro. I know it's kind of hard to tell, but she freaked out, right? And then, of course, I don't know how many of you experience this, but you go back and say, your Arabic is different. Right? Which is a way of pointing out that you don't quite belong. Well, of course, my Arabic is not that different. I speak Arabic better than half the people there. But it's not the issue here. The issue is that they are creating markers. And here, I love this question, where are you from? So I say, Raleigh. No, really, really, where are you from? I don't know. I tell them the neighborhood in Raleigh. Or one person came up to me, they do this regularly. You speak English so well. So I learned to respond by saying, so do you. It's like this kind of surprise in their voices. Because what they're saying is, for a guy that doesn't belong, you're kind of here. But, again, markers. But in sort of, whether it's a legal case, how they dressed, they are, in essence, to integrate. They had to abandon some things. But privately, they kept them. Right? So food becomes one marker. in which they try to maintain, in the sense, this guy's making baklava, and I think it's in Michigan somewhere. And she opened a deli in the 1970s, which now is hugely popular in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's her name is Cecilia, and she's just like a force of nature, I swear. The sweetest person, but boy, I tell you, don't cross her. You'll never get to eat her food ever again, which would be a disaster, right? So food is one thing. But again, here's what's interesting. We tend to think that food doesn't change, but we've been looking at recipes. Now, as you know, many of these people were peasants, and peasants didn't have access to meat a lot. But what you notice very quickly when they arrive here and they start putting out the recipes, they load it with meat and butter. Because all of a sudden, they can eat in ways they could not eat before. I mean, before they were getting 700-800 calories a day, which is really minimal. And by the way, the same thing with the Italians. What we consider to be Italian food, the pasta and the heavy stuff, all that stuff was created here, right? But food becomes a marker, becomes a private marker about who you are. And the other quick way to identify as belong something is to create your own religion. So in the eastern part of North Carolina, where we did a lot of our work, the Catholic Church was established by these immigrants. Some of the earliest missions and then later parishes were by these guys. The Druze community was also established its own religious things. Some of the earliest mosques were in Rapid City, Iowa. That's the first mosque in America, followed by Dearborn, Michigan, of course. And I realize I'm fast-forwarding through this, but I also want you to understand that this wasn't straightforward. Just like with food, religion didn't mean you just brought it in and everybody was hunky-dory. I have about 2,500 letters that were written between 1899 and 1936 to the patriarch Hwayik, who was the Maronite patriarch, by people from primarily the United States, some from Mexico and South America, but mostly the United States. And the letters were always complaining about something going on. Priests that are lecherous, or who are not really, doing their job properly. Guys who are, walking around and arguing with each other over who's going to run the parish. I mean, so it wasn't straightforward, but it.
It's still going on.
I know, of course it is. You should see the argument we have in our local mosque now. I mean, it's just horrifying. It's just. So these arguments, on one side they're hilarious. There's one case in Buffalo where they collected affidavits that were they had the notary public who didn't speak Arabic, but these are all Arabic affidavits, saying that the priest there was consorting with women in his room, and he was getting drunk and gambling, and he's not really paying attention to his priestly duties. And then they had another guy in New York. Huh?
What was the purpose of notarizing it?
To show that it's official. Because it gives them the seal of the state. Because there was actually tension between who has authority over the community. The secular leadership, because you have to remember they're coming into a congregational religion. And so that basically meant that the community that built the churches felt like they should have a greater say than the priest. And the tensions, of course, are legion. The priest had the ultimate authority of excommunication. Probably the most famous case of that is Amir Rehani. I don't know if you know who he is, but Amir Rehani is much more important to me personally than Gibran Khalil Gibran. People love Gibran, but Rehani is a much more brilliant writer in many ways. And he wrote Thulathiyat, it's called Thulathiyat, in which he critiques Muslim, Christian, Catholic, and Protestant priests, and he argues for deism, for the fact that there's one God, therefore there should be one religion. He was excommunicated. The other part of belonging is this idea of gender. So these people arrive here. Women have always worked. I have studied the history of Lebanon from the 1600s forward, and there's not a period that I've studied in which women are not working. This is not shocking to anybody. Women have always worked, historically speaking. But generally, what you find is they worked within the confines of what's considered family-oriented. But you see something like this, which is a factory, the Sakal factory in Brooklyn. Women are working next to men that they don't know. And all of a sudden, there's this huge debate that begins to happen whether women's work, especially as peddler, is undermining the honor of the Syrians. So women's bodies become very much tied to the honor of the community. And people go back and forth on this. And ultimately, of course, when you have some women who are making more money than their husbands, that creates tensions within the family. Right? These guys are coming with fairly traditional notion about what women do, what men do. But in this new territory, that wasn't always the case. And the other thing is, of course, tons and tons of newspapers. I mean, these guys produced, by last count, about 65 different newspapers and magazines between 1899 and the 1950s. This is a population of 120,000, remember. A lot of them are illiterate, but they would still get Al-Huda or Mir'at al-Gharb. And even if they were illiterate, they would. I have a picture of a guy holding the newspaper upside down. But it just was a symbol of kind of like, you know, this is where I belong. Because it gives you a sense, I mean, just to see the Arabic gives you a sense of comfort. I don't know how, if you experience this, but I mean, I'm fairly comfortable with English, I'm fairly comfortable with French. That's fine. But the minute somebody speaks in Lebanese, there's something that is emotional about it that is very different than English. English is never an emotional language to me. It's a practical language in that regard. And you have writers, again, people that you've heard of, Gibran Khalil Gibran, Khayyam Naimi, Amir Rihani, these intellectuals who begin to basically articulate what it means to be Arab. And what's powerful about these guys, by the way, including Afifa Karam, one of the first feminists and first women writers in the Middle East and in the United States, obviously. She lived in Louisiana, in Shreveport. Died fairly young. She's from Amshit. Anybody from Amshit? You're from Amshit? Jej. You're from Jej? And I'm من Lahfid. Right next neighbors. And in fact, my grandmother's from Jej. Yeah. Anyway, so these guys, the Arabic that they created, what's really fascinating, I mean, I was talking to Peter Tannous in DC. He's the head of the American Task Force for Lebanon. He was saying, did you know that, you know, they created the first Arabic linotype, you know, which they did. But not only did they create the first movable typeface in Arabic, they broke the Arabic language and re-put it together to fit their needs. Because you can imagine the Arabic that they came away with, most of them were semi-literate, or if literate, not very much, just didn't fit their new lives. And they just literally broke it and created what we know today, to a certain extent, modern standard Arabic. And they broke it away from religion as well. It becomes a secular language. I got to play this for you. Oh, wait. I don't have connection. Oh, yeah, I do. Is there sound here? Can you hear it? I can't figure out why the volume is not going up.
Maybe it's on the. No, put your mouse cursor on that again.
No, it's not going. It's controlled here.
That works too.
I want you to listen to the lyrics for those who can. So he's talking about gambling, betting on horses. And the whole song is about how his wife is going to kill him. She sent him out to buy oil, and he goes and puts money on it. But think about it. For somebody to make a song about this, what does that tell us? That was a fairly common problem. Gambling actually became a very big problem for them because they encountered a lot of new things. But they were on Washington Street, which is in Lower East Side, Manhattan. On Washington Street, 2 blocks, they had 6 recording studios. And they had musical troupes and singers that toured the whole United States. They would go from one mahrajan to the next, one big festival. So again, it's another thing you can imagine, sort of the pianola, Iskandar Ma'louf becomes a very famous composer. In fact, he composes the music to Valentino's movie. And he composes for Hollywood thereafter. And it's always kind of this very Orientalist, lavish music sounding. But at the same time, some of the recordings were very kind of falih, very peasant. You can hear that. And performances. I mean, they performed everywhere because they themselves began to embody this. So she's a fascinating woman from Baalbek who called herself Princess Rahmi Haidar. She claimed to be descended of princes and princesses. Gibran, by the way, claimed that he descended from princes as well. His father, as you know, Gibran Khalil Gibran, his father, as you well know, was not a prince. Neither Prince Charming nor a real prince. He was a bit of a drunk, his father. But anyway, she would actually go from church to church. She was Protestant, or she converted. And she would go and perform. I mean, she even had, she had made a film in Baalbek with her standing and striking poses. And she would come and play it in these, sort of churches and tell them all about the East, right? And she made a life like that. It's really quite a remarkable woman. Yeah. So the point I wanted to make in all of this, and again, we're now moving into 1965, I think, is that these people came in fairly large numbers. Again, nowhere near the Italians or the Irish. The Italians and the Irish had millions. But still a significant number. About a third of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean, or what we know today as Lebanon, left. A third of the population. That's a huge percentage, right? And in doing so, they arrive here and they create a whole life that is integrated. And it's that history, in many ways, that both the center and myself and many others have dedicated, and Dr. Farah, is it Farah? Dr. Farah has dedicated their lives to capturing. Because as I tell a lot of my young students, if we don't tell our story, somebody else will. And the story is not going to be to our liking. Anyway, thank you so much for being here tonight, and we can have questions and answers. Thanks. Yeah.
When I think about a parallel, so entertainers, tightrope walkers,
Sure.
they're the ones that they have to have a perfect balance. They maintain a very fine line, and they're walking it, and they're not deterred by anything. If I were to give you that as an analogy to what you mentioned before, where able to assimilate yet retain, where have you seen some good examples of where people were able to successfully do that, kind of live in both worlds as a great tightrope walker?
It's a great question. I tend to shy away from the notion of assimilation, because the way we understand assimilation is you take somebody from a place and you bring them in and they become something. But what's interesting is that, and in fact that's part of the argument I'm making, is that they change, of course, everybody has to change, but in the process they also change wherever they come to. That's a continuing process. I mean, the United States, I remember when I first came to the US in 1978, I went to St. Paul, Minnesota, McAllister College, and the excitement was that Taco Bell was opening. That was considered the height of ethnic food, Taco Bell. Literally, people were standing in line. Now, of course, today, we smile and we laugh because we are a foodie culture in which the world is here. I mean, I don't know what your food situation is like here, but Raleigh, within the last 20 years that I've been there, has exploded in terms of the things you can eat. So they change America as much as America changes them. I don't think anybody represents one way, but generally speaking, the people who succeed most, the pattern, if you will, are the people who are able to adjust to the American way of being. And what I mean by that is primarily the middle class way of being. So what you see them doing is they send their kids, first generation gets here, they send their kids to school, universities. And that permits them to gain access, I mean, like yourself, to professional jobs. The parents become very keen on the idea that education is key to entering the middle class in America. And they had that idea to a certain extent before they arrived, but here it becomes even more acute. And they tend to be the one who succeed the most in that regard. But I don't think there's one way in which we can say that they did it, really. But you can see a pattern. The parents arrive, their English is always kind of semi-broken, their children speak English better, and they go into school, and then they get jobs outside, business, if you will, and then they move into the next stage. By third generation, they're intermarrying with the larger society. They retain a little bit of element of Arabic, maybe curse words mostly. They know the food very well, but their link begins to be diluted. But what is interesting about the Arab community, actually, what I've seen, at least in some places, and this is not pertinent to the question per se, but still, even in the 1940s and 50s, as you begin to see this dwindling by the third generation, then you begin to see a arrival of a new wave of Arabs coming here. And that kind of creates interesting linkages, I find. But I honestly, I mean, I can think of individuals, I can give you names, but I don't think there's a particular way that people have succeeded, per se, in that regard.
I just want to ask, in spite of all the education that Arab communities have in comparison to other communities, statistically speaking, it was shown that the Arab community, the offsprings, are highly educated and their income is much higher than, let's say, the average American, which makes me think, why have we not made, any, not necessarily impression, but a change to the perception, to the stereotype
Sure.
that we have, apart from Jack Shaheen, who passed recently.
Yeah, unfortunately, he did.
And he had a book called Real Arab.
Real Bad Arabs.
Yeah, Real Bad Arabs. Why haven't we made change to...
Sure. It's a great question. So I sit on the U.S. Census Bureau's advisory board for ethnic and race, advocating for Arab Americans. One is we don't have data. We still don't know how many Arab Americans there are really. We guesstimate. Let me give you an example. When the U.S. Census Bureau publishes something, they have certain studies, something called the American Community Survey. When they come to Arabs, it's plus or minus 30% certainty about the numbers. This is how pathetic the numbers are. So one is that kind of problematic, is we don't have data that connects us. Two, Arabs aren't a single ethnicity, as you very well know. So another example, when I started serving on the Census Bureau, I was approached by a group of people that are Maronite Lebanese. I myself come from a Maronite background. And they asked for a meeting with me before our semi-annual meeting in the Census Bureau. They knew I was serving. And they approached me and they said, we would like you to advocate for the Maronites to be counted different than Arabs. Right? And they're not the only ones. The Iraqi Assyrians and the Chaldeans. And by the way, the Chaldeans have been able to convince the Census Bureau to count them as separate. And there are Coptic Christians who wanted to do the same thing. Right? So we are riven. We're not a single entity by any means. Neither, by the way, were the Italians or the Irish or what have you, because they had their own divisions, and the Jewish community, of course, had its own divisions. But to a certain extent, we have a bigger problem in the sense that we come from 22, 24 different nations that are very evident very quickly. The Yemeni is very distinguished from, somebody who is from Lebanon, and there's a sense of divisions that seem to fail. But there's another element that I think is also very powerful. It is that the United States' involvement in the Middle East has, generally speaking, from World War II, from just 1948, the creation of the State of Israel subsequently, has been negative. If you put it in balance, it's been fairly negative, right? And in that time period, the image of the Arab has gotten worse and worse and worse. I can point to periods when, 1967, the Arab-Israeli War, you see an uptick. And that's when the film Exodus, by the way, is produced. It becomes incredibly popular. And of course, Exodus is Zionist propaganda. But it becomes very wildly popular. And at the time that America is losing in Vietnam, Israel appears like the superheroes because they beat the pants off the Arabs, right? And collectively speaking. 1973, the oil embargo. And that's when you begin to see what Jack Shaheen so beautifully captures, the hook nose and the sheikh and the lectures and that stereotype of what an Arab is. I mean, people were asking me when I first arrived, it's like, people would ask me about camels and oil. I'm going, dude, the first time I ever saw a camel was in the LA Zoo, and I've never seen oil in my life. Would I be here if I had an oil well? Are you kidding me? So there's that element. And this continues again and again and again. 1982, right? I mean, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and then what you begin to see, and of course, the Iraq, several wars. So I think it's that constant thing. You don't see that with the Italians and the Irish. I mean, we don't have that issue with the Irish or the Italians. And I think that becomes a real problem in many ways. And it's not a benign problem. It actually becomes an industry. I mean, there's a real industry in the United States to attack Arabs and Muslims, and including people who are themselves of the Middle East, of the minorities of the Middle East, right? Who make a very nice living talking about how Muslims are all just this or Muslims are just that and the Arabs are like this. So there's a whole industry that goes about doing this. That is, some of it, quite honestly, I don't know where the funding comes from, but they have a lot of money. I don't know if you remember, it was when Mr. Obama was first running, and all of a sudden, in all the major cities in the United States, the Sunday newspaper came with a DVD. Does anyone remember that?
Yes.
It was a DVD that was basically attacking Muslims as, yeah. And it was just remarkable. Can you imagine how much money went into doing that kind of distribution? Every newspaper. I'm not talking just one or two cities. They literally marketed to the whole United States. I mean, that's a lot of power. On the flip side, the Arabs who have money, primarily the Gulf states, are not funding anything that I think is worthwhile. They have lobbyists, and they pay them very dearly, but they have lobbyists to make sure that nobody bothers them back there. And in fact, the relation between the Arab American community and the Arab states are very tense. I mean, just to give you an idea, I approached Aramco, which has a lobbying arm, and it has a Aramco. It's the Saudi oil company, and they have lots of money, right? I said to them, look, you know, we would like to put together a traveling exhibit, you know, to highlight the presence of Arabs in this country. Nothing political, I promise you, just simply, just telling the story. And, you know, when we made this documentary, we made a documentary about the Lebanese in North Carolina. And I mean, I use the Lebanese as a term, not because I think that's, because there were Syrians as well and what Palestinians. But it's not a brilliant documentary. I mean, I look at it now and I'm kind of like, oh gosh, I can't believe we did this. We should have, you know how when you do something, you always go back and say. So I'm not saying it was a brilliant documentary, but when we finished showing it, first of all, we had a packed house of 400 people. The fire marshal was really upset with us. It was at the North Carolina Museum of History, and we chose it because we wanted to put that story right there. People were crying because for the first time, somebody told their story as part of the story of North Carolina. They could see the things they knew privately. I mean, and this is what Dr. Farah does, and I don't know the rest of you. I only point to him because I know his book. I mean, that's what he's trying to do, to bring the story public. So I went to Aramco and I said, please, help us with this. Not a penny. Not a penny, right? But if you go to National Endowment for Humanities, they see the value and they give you a little bit of money for it. So
one thing I noticed in the textbooks of the curriculum in the education institutions, be it here or in Canada where I taught, even the stereotype is quite prevailing in the textbook,
yeah.
where similar saying is done
Oh, yeah, yeah.
as this guy from the senator from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, Senator Reid.
And when you address that, I think there's a lot of reluctance of changing the textbook or even
Oh, yeah,
addressing
yeah.
the issue.
Yeah, yeah. You can't change the textbooks, obviously. Like, I mean, the United States, anyway, I don't know about Canada, but the United States, Texas drives the textbook market. And Texas is a hyper-conservative board of education. I got involved with that a little bit because I became a consultant on the Middle East section for, I don't need to name the book, but I was a consultant for a high school textbook. And when they showed me what they had, I was absolutely horrified. And I'm not talking here that it should be good for the Arabs versus the Israelis, but it was so out of date. I mean, the scholarship was so out of date. It's nonsense. It's stereotypical in the worst sense, right? I mean, if it was pro-Israeli, but actually a solid piece of historical work, yeah, okay, I might tolerate it. But it was crap. It was absolute crap. And I brought it up in meeting after meeting and went to Texas and we talked to people. So, I mean, there is an inertia. And I think that's a very problematic situation. I think we're beginning to see a little bit of change, but unfortunately 9/11 sent us back quite a bit.
This president sending us back.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think that goes, at least for those of us who are in different politics, yeah, I agree.
How do you feel that the social medias are going to help assimilate, basically, cultures within cultures?
It doesn't. It creates tribalism. I mean, we know both from the Russia investigation, but really forget the Russia investigation, just from how people go. I mean, I don't know where you guys go on social media, but people tend to go to places that make them feel good. And I see that in myself. I have to force myself to read news from sources that I don't trust and I don't like, just as an exercise. Because my natural instinct is go New York Times, The Guardian in England, and I trust those to be a little better. But I force myself to literally, hard times, to read Fox News. And I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's just my politics are different. And so I know where I want to be comfortable. And you get tired. I think people get tired. So social media becomes a place where they get reaffirmed in whatever it is, unfortunately. So I don't see it as doing a whole lot that is really great. I mean, if it's social media is going to drive this, 50% of Facebook pages are in Arabic. 50%. The highest number. So you would think, just statistically speaking, we should be, it doesn't have much of a presence at all.
So there's not a lot of political activism by there. Like, if you really want to make an influence, you donate to a politician.
Sure.
And they will listen to you for
Yeah.
months, right? And a lot of it. Do you see that increasing here at all for those?
So there's an attempt. So you have you have several major organizations, but of course they're not always working the same way. There's Arab American Institute, the Zughbi outfit. There's Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, which it's really gone in fits and starts. Nowadays it seems to be kind of floating to a certain extent. Not as strong as it used to be. There's the American Jewish Society. I mean, you have a lot of lobbying interests, but they're not always working in concert. I'll give you an idea. So we wanted to lobby the Census Bureau to include something called MENA category. So right now, if you are doing the census in the United States, there's no place for you, if you don't want to be white, to say, I am from the Middle East and North Africa. So we wanted them to test it. Not included in the census, because that actually requires a congressional act, believe it or not. But we just wanted them to test it, because initial testing that we helped them conduct showed the focus groups really wanted the MENA category, that they didn't feel like they belong in white. To them, white meant something different, and certainly not black or Hispanic or Native American or Pacific Islander. So they said, why don't you have a category, just an ethnic category that says MENA, Middle East and North Africa. So we were trying to bring various groups, the Chaldeans, the Maronites, this and that, all to come together and agree on.
That's always been the problem.
It was a huge
It's
problem.
not nationalism. It's always like, we adapt very quickly, and that's what I've seen, being involved with the community, the Lebanese community. We adapt very quickly to what's around us because we want to be successful. We
Right.
live in, but there's always like, what part of Lebanon are you?
Right.
You might be from
Right.
Zahli, you might be from here, so
Sure.
it's like such a small country.
Yeah.
but we
And they always ask me about my religion. They always say, so,
Yes, we just don't have the nationalism that everybody else has, like
Right.
whether you're Irish or Italian, and that's been our problem. is
Yeah.
we stick together.
I mean, look, if you look at any communities, the idea of an ethnic community is a bit of a fiction anyway. So even the Italians and the Irish used to fight amongst each other. But with generations, you still fight, but you come to a point where you feel you have to come together.
We don't have that.
But back to the point of money, Arab Americans haven't entered the age of philanthropy as of yet. There are a few individuals that have put in millions, but they put them in specifically for self-aggrandizement, right? They may name a college dormitory, but anything that's for them. They haven't entered in the notion of the sort of the common weal, as we call it, the greater good. And so, like, the Arab American National Museum now has a sort of a small division that is dedicated to researching Arab American philanthropy. It's like, and in essence, to teaching people that, look, you create a legacy by giving money. You don't hoard it, which is the natural thing. People come work hard and they accumulate money and they love to show their money off. I have this anecdote, just kind of. So there's this friend of mine who's a photographer. He's very well known. He's worked for the World Health Organization. He's really quite internationally known. Anyway, a very wealthy Lebanese guy in New York wants to throw a 50th birthday party for his wife. He rents out this whole restaurant to the tune of $100,000 some dollars, birthday party. And they hire this guy to take photographs of the event. Now this guy is internationally known, and they negotiate him down, and they negotiate him down, and they negotiate him down, and they negotiate him down. And then when he does the job, they wouldn't pay him. Right? It's that kind of mentality. So I think, it's not to say everybody's like this. I don't think everybody's like this. I think there are, but we haven't quite entered into this comfortable zone of giving. The exception I would have to tell you is the center. Obviously, you can tell it's the name of a person, because he gave $8 million to endow the center. Now that is the single largest endowment. But he gave it as to sort of create this center which preserves and shares the history of the Lebanese. I usually extend it to all Arabic speakers in the United States, because he has that kind of vision. But he's one in about 1,000. I have many of these examples. So in Lebanon, as you all know, probably, teachers of history, or history as a subject, has been very politicized. So in essence, it has been completely ignored. History teachers are not trained pedagogically or anything. Nobody pays attention because it's too much of a political football. So we came up with this idea. It's like, look, why don't we bring 20, 30 teachers from Lebanon every summer, train them here for about a month, bring scholars who study Lebanese history to teach about that. We have a great college of education, focus on pedagogy, and pair them with American teachers so they can learn new methods. And then, give them a couple of days to go to Washington, D.C., explore America. Great. For $50,000. That's the whole budget, $50,000. Now, it's a lot for me, but it's really not a lot for a project of this nature. We couldn't get anybody to give us any money for this. And I approached 6 different guys with such deep pockets. $50,000 would mean nothing to them. I mean, they blow it on a fishing trip. Nope, wouldn't touch it. Finally, we went to the American embassy in Beirut, and they're very interested. And they said, 50,000, that's not enough. Let's give you 250,000.
Wow.
I mean, this is the absurdity of it. It is. It's very frustrating because they don't see beyond this. So, I mean, it's a very good question, but it's frustrating.
Do you think that there's any strength in anything that we have that will in any way win over the control of the media that the other people have that aren't Lebanese?
Not really. No, I don't think we have that capacity. I mean, the numbers are not that huge per se.
You mean the numbers of the other people? I know there's only.
No. I mean, numbers for us. But I mean, I think one of the ways that I argue for is that we have to stop thinking as an isolated community. I think we have to start creating alliances. We're not the only ones who are attacked. I mean, the Hispanic community, for example, which is now the second largest community after white population. You can think of any community. There are alliances that have to be. The problem is we tend to look inwards. Even for solution to our problems, we look inwards. The idea, but there's a new generation. There's a new generation of Arab Americans that I've seen that are beginning to look beyond the boundaries and say, look, we cannot just do this on our own. We might be 3.3 million, but really we're not 3.3 million, as you can imagine. Let's reach out. And I think that is probably the only way that you're going to get beyond this idea, because a lot of ethnic communities have the same thing. I mean, I'm sure you've heard things being said about the Hispanic community. You know, M113, gang, they're all gangs, they're all rapists. I mean, this kind of nonsense that, I mean, immigrants are such hardworking people. I was taking a course, a sociology course at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and we had a large migrant labor community. And our professor insisted that, she said, you've got to go, we're not studying them as subjects. I want you to go work next to them. So she arranged for us to go pick Brussels sprouts and strawberries for a day. That's all. They said, I just want you to go for a day. You start in the morning, you finish with them at night, and I want you to experience that. I hated strawberries by the end of the day. I didn't eat strawberries for months and months and months. I mean, one day, and I was crying like a little baby. It's like, it was 10 o'clock in the morning, I was crying. And this woman next to me, I mean, she was like, she reminded me of my aunt, who was a good peasant woman, short and stocky, and she just raced through, and I'm like, and I was like in my 20s. So when people talk about lazy immigrants, I just want to laugh. I was like, are you kidding me? You know? So I think that's the way I see it for me personally as a sort of a political project, is to tell our story and to tell it again and again and again. It's a long-term process, but also alliances. Like when we showed the film, there were people of Polish background, Italian background, said, this is just like us, which of course it is. We're not that unique. And I hate it when people say the Lebanese are exceptional. I mean, they're not exceptional. I'm sorry, they're not. I'm Lebanese, very proud to be Lebanese. You know, you go to Lebanon and say, have you seen a more beautiful country? I'm like, yeah, I have. Are you kidding me? Have you seen what we've done with garbage and the water and the pollution? I mean, we don't need to romanticize to be proud of who we are. I mean, I'm very proud of being, you know, Lebanese descent and Arab American. I'm very proud of it, but we cannot romanticize it. We have to see our warts, but also we have to reach out and say, you know, your experience is like mine. Why don't we work together? And I think that becomes a much more powerful narrative than if we just isolate ourselves. Here's our story, so to speak. So, you know, we do regular workshops for teachers in North Carolina, and we always talk about immigration as a whole. So we bring in Chinese immigrants, we bring in Hispanic immigrants. So we don't isolate just, you know, we sponsor it, but it becomes a very powerful narrative because they can't isolate us anymore. We become part of a very big narrative.
Even if you're not an immigrant, I'm born in this country, they still isolate you.
Oh, I know.
Who's going to arrange for all this integration to bring other people to help us? I mean,
You know, I have a lot of faith in young people, not because they're young, but because they haven't learned what they cannot do yet. So you begin to see it a little bit in this. So, for example, we used to have like Palestinian Film Festival, right? Which is good. But then all of a sudden in San Francisco, they began to think, why don't we just bring in not just Palestinian or Lebanese or something. Why don't we have a theme and bring films, South Asian films, Hispanic films, Arab films, that talk to the same theme? And it was an incredibly popular festival. So there are these grassroots efforts that are emerging. Again, I'm not I did go to school in California, but I'm not utopian. I don't think we will all hold hands, sing kumbaya, and love each other. But I do see that kind of bubbling, and I think there's a sense of urgency now that I haven't seen before, for obvious reasons, because people's lives literally are on the, including 800,000, dreamers or what have you. But I think you're beginning to see an element of that in that regard. And by the way, what's interesting is that in the 1960s and 70s, that happened for a brief moment. During the civil rights period, that's when you begin to see Arab Americans trying to merge with African Americans. And there were many instances in which they did. It was really quite fascinating, actually, because they saw Palestine, which was the main cause of that time period, and then civil rights as two of the same issues. One group of people dominating another, right? Here it's whites against blacks. There it's Israeli Zionists against, Palestinian Arabs.
Thank you, Akram. That was excellent. I have two questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
The first one is actually connected to what you were just saying. We wanted to ask you about the history of the Association of Arab American University Graduates.
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple of books written recently about the Arab American left.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
The one that I'm thinking, the only one that I've read, and the one that I'm thinking of, is a book by Keith Feldman, The Imperial Life of Race in America. And one of the arguments that he makes is that after '67, when the association is founded by Edward Said and Rahim Abu Lubud, that this actually brings Arab Americans into the civil rights sphere,
Right,
into other
right.
spheres, and so they're building these coalitions. So the question is, why isn't that happening today? Or is it happening today and we're not seeing it? The second question, I was born and raised in Canada. And
Which part?
Ottawa. And I actually met somebody one time and was speaking to them in Arabic, and they said, "You were born in Ottawa, weren't you?" They could tell from the accent.
Wow.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how this story is different if we tell it from Canada.
So I'll answer the second question first. I don't think it's that different, but I don't know it.
Okay.
I know snippets of it from Nova Scotia, from Saskatchewan, from various areas, Montreal, of course. But so the snippets that I've heard sound very, very familiar. And in fact, if you go to Argentina and Brazil, it's very familiar as well. The difference is that although Canada, of course, has its own problem with racism, there was a greater space. And same in Brazil and Argentina. They're both racial regimes, but there was still greater space, if you will. There was still attacks against El Turcos, as they were called down there. But in Brazil, for example, nobody shies away from calling bread Arabic bread. What the hell is pita? It's like people kept saying pita and pita. I'm like, what are you talking about? Khubz Arabi. Right? And in Brazil, they call it khubz Arabi. Right? And shawarma is like the street food.
It used to be called khubz Arabi.
Well, I'm sure it was till somebody got their...
When I was a kid and my mother would...
What else would they call it?
cook food. In fact, when I was a younger woman...
Where did you grow up?
Here, Philadelphia. I went to this university. When I was a kid, when I was a younger woman, and friends would come over, and I'm a physician, so I have a lot of Jewish friends. Oh, we love Lebanese food. What? It's all become Israeli food now. there isn't any more hummus. I mean, wait, isn't that the Arabic word for chicken? I'm sorry.
Yes, it has changed. It has quite a bit.
It's all become Israeli.
So somebody was joking to me. He says, you know what? You've stolen our land. You've stolen our women. You've stolen our lives. But don't steal our food.
Well, why is that? This is what I'm saying. Why are we going?
Because it's a competition.
Well-
Because those are very competitive people, and they regard us as their enemy. And so.
Well, I mean, I think it's also marketing. It's also making money. I mean, it's just what they do.
Arabs had decades to capitalize on it. I take a different view on that. Arabs had 100 years to create a sabra hummus. They didn't. I mean, they should have, right? You talk about peddlers, you talk about great salespeople. I would say it's exactly what you said. They just couldn't mobilize, they couldn't get it together, and this should be a case study.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you drop the ball.
It is a little bit easier when people pave your way into a different environment than we're able to do. You know, I'm in my mid-60s, so I kind of lived through the 1967 war. And I recall when I was in the 8th grade in my class in the public high school during the 1967 war, I was a fairly well-read kid. And I recall having a discussion between me, my Jewish history teacher, and my 75% Jewish classroom about what was really happening in the Middle East. And I recall quoting some things from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is where you quote things when you're 13 years old, and having the teacher sort of create a debate. And it was me, and then it was John Schwartz, and then it was me, and it was Brad Trachtenberg. So it was, and of course they began with Brad Trachtenberg, and they ended the discussion with someone who didn't have a Lebanese last name. So it was really systematic.
I mean, I think that's a very good point, but also I think you do raise a good point. However, food is very political.
But they would always make restaurants, and it was, I mean, Halal Guys is just new now. The fact that Halal Guys is in King of Prussia. But to actually commercially create something that could be nationwide.
They tried. They actually did. I mean, like the first restaurant was called the Sheikh, the Chic. It was in New York. It was very popular. If you go to Louisiana, they still make kibbeh in some of the restaurants that the Lebanese started. And kibbeh becomes part of the Louisiana cuisine. In fact, the Kitchen Sisters, I don't know if you ever listened to the Kitchen Sisters. It's an NPR show, and they did a great episode on it. But I'm going to go back to Delta Force for a moment. There's a scene in Delta Force in which Chuck Norris is facing these terrorists, and then he dips his fingers into hummus, right? And then he puts it in, and then he spits it out and says, what is this S word, right? So right there, it's kind of this absolute disgust for it, this crossover. And nowadays, Lebanese food is completely accepted. And I'll give you an opposite example. So I have a friend who's Palestinian, and he owns a series of restaurants called Jasmine's Mediterranean and Lebanese food. And I said to him, I said, why don't you call it Palestinian? You're not Lebanese. I mean, why are you kidding me? Nobody would come here. They would think I'm a terrorist. Right? So, I mean, food is very politicized. I think that there's an aspect of it in which I think people did try. And nowadays, of course, I think we've succeeded. Has anybody seen the Geico commercial with Lebanese food? I mean, that's when you know Lebanese food has become mainstream. There's Dracula at a blood bank, and this guy comes in, and Dracula looks at him and says, what did you have for lunch? And he says, the guy kind of is nervous, says, Lebanese food? He says, I love Lebanese food, right? I mean, it's like, and this is Geico, and then you go, Geico. And you know that we've become mainstream. And in fact, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is beginning to understand that this is a big money maker for Lebanon, and they're hosting olive tasting, and so on and so forth. So there is an awareness, but I think, I mean, in the 1960s...
At a micro level, though, you're talking restaurants, I'm saying nothing that's commercially distributed.
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, you have to understand that, first of all, the community, just until the 60s, had dissolved in various places, and they really didn't have the momentum. You have 120,000 people and their children. They don't have that momentum to build what the Italians did, which is a breakout cuisine. I mean, the Italians, for the longest time, just cooked Italian food. Until the 1940s and 50s, it's hard to find an Italian restaurant anywhere. And then all of a sudden, in the 60s and 70s, it becomes the place to go with the Chianti bottle and the red candle, and that's a breakout, but that took a long time, and you had to adjust the cuisine because Americans weren't used to the real Italian food. That didn't happen because we just didn't have the numbers. And then you hit the 60s and 70s, and being Arab really was not cool, right? And to break into and say, hey, let me introduce you to some falafel, at that point it's like falafel. But I want to go back to the two questions you asked. So the first one, as I said, I'm not really sure. The second one, it's a very good point. I mean, I think Edward Said and Abu Lughod were quite instrumental, and the Arab American University. I mean, I have to say, this is where Edward Said was brilliant in many ways. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Edward Said, but he's, I mean, he's just a genius. And he was the nicest guy. I met him when I was a graduate student, and I mean, he was giving a talk at University of California, Santa Cruz, and I had his book, Orientalism, like a little puppy. I'm like, Dr. Said. And he actually sat there and talked to me for 15 minutes as if I mattered in his world. And this guy was like world renowned. Anyway. Where he was brilliant with Orientalism is that he didn't limit it to just a particular group, the Lebanese or the Arabs or the Syrians. Orientalism becomes a way to deconstruct how the West sees the East in general. And I think that's the power of his book and his reach, where right now everybody reads Edward Said, including people who study East Asian studies, my colleagues. We don't see anybody like him at this point, an intellectual of his caliber that is able. Rashid Khalidi at Columbia tries, and he's a brilliant man, but he doesn't have that crossover ability as of yet. But I do see, again, as I said earlier, there are attempts to create these alliances, to sort of transcend it, if you will. And to a certain extent, I don't know if you remember the impromptu demonstrations that broke out when Mr. Trump first announced his Muslim ban. Right. I mean, I think that in itself is an indication that there is some breakthrough, to a certain extent, some breakthrough. That is coming at different levels. The Axis of Evil comedy tour is another entryway in which you sort of make fun of the very... but I don't see anything that is concerted, no. I have not seen it. Nothing that has been institutionalized. And I think that's the Achilles heel of the movement. It is up here, up there, but nothing that is institutionalized into a real sense. Catherine?
In connection with that, I found what you said about having your own identity but also making connections to be really interesting. And I was thinking of the case of the UK and the use of the word black there, and it means something slightly different than it means here. It encompasses more ethnic identities.
Right.
There's been some really effective sort of cross-ethnic organizing on specific issues of black and minority ethnic people, like the Southall Black Sisters are an old organization. Really effective because they were founded in an era when the sort of civil struggles and legal struggles of people from the Caribbean and people from the global South generally were very much seen as shared.
Right.
And so that's something that there has persisted and here seems to have kind of died out after the civil rights era. And I'm wondering how much of that is not down to communities lacking an identity or lacking sort of wherewithal, but just the structure of American politics or American activism.
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure about the structure of American politics. I can only observe what people do, what I've noticed as a pattern. And it's a pattern that I talked about in terms of race. In order to become white, early Arab Americans had to accept the racial regime, right? In other words, to gain access to the power that whiteness gives you, better social status, better income, and more security, that individual notion, which, or at least at a very small scale communal thing, in order to do that, they were willing to accept the system as it is, which is, of course, is the power of the system. And I think for a lot of, today, for a lot of Arab Americans who are descendants or new arrivals, their primary goal is how do I become part of the middle class? And you cannot fault them for that. They want to be successful. And the definition of success in America is, to a certain extent, middle class life for the majority. Of course, if you become super rich, like Trump's friend who is Lebanese American, that's fine, but very few people will get that. So entering the middle class, though, means you have to abandon the identity politics, right? And you have to accept, to a certain extent, the system as it stands, because middle class life demands some element of it. I mean, you cannot be too radical as a middle class person. You could be, irritated at some things, but not a radical. And what I mean by that is somebody that is going to shake the system completely. You have to, and the system gives you enough, I think, awards that it kind of convinces enough people to not do that. Plus all the divisions I talked about is a real serious problem. So I mean, I think that's kind of the issue that I see happening here.
So you think we've sort of racialized a notion of what it means to be middle class and also made middle class the aspirational identity.
Right.
So in
It
contrast
is.
to the UK, it's not the racial element, and also working class is a really widely shared and valid identity.
Right. I mean, Arabs never want to be working class. I mean, it's really interesting. We interview people over and over again when this oral history project is ongoing, and they never want to tell you that their parents worked in a factory. It's like Aib. They want to tell you that they owned a store because that's respectable, right? But we know that men and women worked in factories. In fact, we have a very famous picture of this young girl. She must have been 12, up in New Hampshire, I think, or Vermont, running from a some factory. She had almost cut off her thumb with a knife. Her mom couldn't go with her that day. She had to stay working on her shift as the girl was running, and the photographer followed her all the way home. I mean, we have evidence. We have records of kids at the age of 14, 15, 16 entering into the factories. But they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about being middle class. Because for immigrants, that's a definition of success. Otherwise, why are you an immigrant? Why are you leaving everybody and coming here? I mean, I told Father Ellis this. So, I mean, my wife and I, we raise our children in a very modest home. It's literally 1,400 square feet. So my sister, the first time, came to visit from Lebanon. I invited her to come for a month. And we're driving. To get to our neighborhood, you go through a fairly large home neighborhood. And my sister was getting impressed. The house was getting bigger. And then I turned the corner into our neighborhood. And here's our little, tiny little home. And my sister was not shy. She said, "This is your house? Tuz." Well, those of you who don't know what tuz is, it means like, oh, crap. And for a whole month, she wouldn't shut up about how small the house is. Like, well, why didn't you buy a bigger house? It was like, because she somehow saw that she was saying I failed because I don't have a big home. And I think we internalized that.